The sound was small against the steel door. Tap, tap, tap. A sound like a bird's beak against a window pane, lost in the November wind that scoured the industrial district. 8:14 p.m. The temperature was 7 degrees Celsius and falling. Rain fell in a cold, persistent mist, turning the asphalt to a slick, black mirror that reflected the indifferent orange glow of a single street lamp. Alara's knuckles were raw, the skin split over the bone. She knocked again, harder this time, the sound a dull thud that seemed to be swallowed by the corrugated metal walls of the warehouse. From within, a low, resonant hum vibrated through the soles of her worn boots, the collective thrum of sleeping iron beasts. She had been here 3 times before. The first time, a man with a beard like tangled wire had opened the door a crack, his eyes sweeping over her thin frame before he dismissed her with a grunt and a shake of his head. The second time, no one had answered at all. The third time, a different man, younger, with tattoos crawling up his neck, had laughed. "This ain't a charity, kid. Scram, but tonight was different." Tonight, the piece of paper in her pocket felt heavier. The final notice, 7 days, and the sound of her little brother's breathing, a shallow, wet whistle, was a constant echo in her mind. So she knocked again, a desperate, rhythmic beat against the unyielding metal. This time, a light flickered on above the door, a bare bulb in a wire cage, casting her in a harsh, clinical glare. The hum from inside quieted for a moment, and she heard the heavy scrape of a bolt being drawn. The door opened, not a crack, but a full foot. A man filled the space. He was immense, a mountain of worn leather and denim. His face was a roadmap of hard miles, a scar cutting a white line through his left eyebrow. This was the man they called Forge. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of bored impatience. He was about to speak, to send her away like the others, but his gaze fell to her hands. She was clutching a small, one-eyed teddy bear, its fur matted and worn smooth from years of anxious squeezing. It wasn't hers. His eyes, the color of faded steel, narrowed slightly. He looked past her, at the empty, rain-swept street, at the distant, glittering towers of a city that had forgotten this corner, and the people who lived in it. In her shivering form, he did not see a nuisance. He saw the final, desperate stand against an unseen, crushing weight. He saw the bear and understood everything. The quiet code, the one that existed beneath the noise and the reputation, was triggered. He stepped back, pulling the heavy door wider. The air that washed over her was warm, thick with the scent of motor oil, old leather, and strong coffee. "Get inside." His voice was a low, gravelly rumble. "Tell me everything." The city housing authority was a place where hope went to die. 2 weeks earlier, she had stood in that same building, a monument to beige bureaucracy on the other side of town. The air inside was stale, recycled through vents that hummed a monotonous, soul-crushing tune. The floor was cheap linoleum, its pattern scuffed into oblivion by the shuffling feet of 1,000 desperate people. She had waited for 2 hours on a hard plastic chair for her number, F72, to be called. The man behind the plexiglass barrier was named Martin Henderson. His nameplate said so. He had a soft, doughy face and eyes that held a profound, practiced indifference. He didn't look at her. He looked at the file in front of him. Her file. It contained her entire life, reduced to a series of forms and numbers. She explained the situation calmly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She spoke of the black mold, a creeping shadow that had conquered the ceiling in her son's room. She described the cold, how the radiator in their apartment, Unit 4B, hissed and clanked but produced no meaningful heat, how the temperature by the window often matched the temperature outside. She showed him the photos she had taken on her cracked phone, blurry images of the dark stains and the ice crystals forming on the inside of the window panes. Henderson had sighed, a long, weary exhalation of someone burdened by the endless, repetitive complaints of the unfortunate. He tapped his pen on the desk. "Ma'am, according to our records, the building's heating system was inspected last month and found to be up to code." He pushed a form toward her. "As for the mildew," he said, using a word that deliberately minimized the threat, That's often a ventilation issue. Tenant responsibility. Have you been opening your windows? She stared at him. Open the windows in November, when the temperature inside was already hovering near freezing. It was a cruel, nonsensical suggestion designed to end the conversation. The landlord, Mr. Croft, he won't do anything, she had whispered, her voice finally cracking. He said if I complain again, he'll evict us. Henderson had finally looked up, his eyes flat and devoid of empathy. Mr. Croft is a respected property owner. He keeps his buildings compliant. If you receive an eviction notice, that is a legal matter between you and your landlord. This office deals with code violations, and according to the official report, there are none. He stamped her form with a heavy, final thud. Denied. The red ink was a stark wound on the cheap paper. He had slid it back under the plexiglass. Next, he called out, his gaze already moving past her to the next weary face in the queue. She had walked out of that building, the stamped paper clutched in her hand, feeling smaller and more invisible than she had ever felt in her life. The system hadn't just failed her. It had actively sided with the cruelty she was trying to escape. It had looked at her suffering, cross-referenced it with a ledger of lies, and declared it acceptable. Unit 4B was not a home. It was a holding cell against the encroaching cold and damp. The two small rooms were on the top floor of a tenement building that had been slowly surrendering to gravity and neglect for half a century. The air inside carried a perpetually damp, earthy scent, the smell of decay. Alara fought it with a fierce, quiet determination. The floors were scrubbed, the single countertop was wiped clean, and their few clothes were neatly folded. But it was a losing battle against the building itself. The enemy was in the walls. In the small bedroom, a sprawling black stain marred the ceiling directly above the little bed, where her 6-year-old son, Leo, slept. It looked like a dark, malevolent continent on an old map, its edges feathery and soft. She had tried to clean it, scrubbing with bleach until her hands were raw and the fumes made her dizzy, but it always returned, darker and more insistent than before. This was where Leo slept, and every night, she would listen to the sound of his breathing. It was a faint, struggling whistle, a sound that tightened a knot of ice in her chest. His blue inhaler sat on the small crate that served as his nightstand, a small plastic sentinel in the gloom. He was a bright, resilient boy. He never complained about the cold. He would simply pull his one thin blanket tighter, his small body curled into a question mark, and whisper goodnight to the one-eyed teddy bear he called Patches. On the wall beside his bed, he had drawn a large, smiling sun with a yellow crayon, a defiant splash of warmth in the perpetual gray. Alara's life was a meticulous calculation of survival. She worked 60 hours a week at a 24-hour diner 8 blocks away. Her uniform always smelled faintly of frying oil and stale coffee, a scent that clung to her hair and clothes no matter how many times she washed them. She left before Leo woke up, and he was usually asleep when she returned, the weight of a 14-hour shift pressing down on her shoulders. Mrs. Gable from 3B, a retired woman whose own apartment was only marginally better, would watch him after school, her kindness a small, flickering candle in the darkness. Alara's paychecks were devoured by rent, by the cheap groceries she bought, by the copay for Leo's inhalers. There was never anything left over. Her world had shrunk to the space between the crumbling apartment and the greasy diner, a circuit of exhaustion and anxiety. And in the center of that world was Leo, his wheezing breaths the ticking clock of her desperation. The eviction notice, taped to her door 2 days ago, had been the final blow. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was a date, a deadline, a declaration that their small, precarious world was about to be erased. The escalation was swift and brutal. 3 nights after her visit to the housing authority, Leo woke up coughing, a deep, barking sound that echoed in the small apartment. His face was pale, his lips tinged with blue. His small chest rose and fell with a terrifying speed. The inhaler did nothing. Alara, her hands shaking, had called 911. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance had painted frantic, dancing patterns on the water-stained walls, a chaotic light show in their dim world. The paramedic, a calm and professional woman, had put a small mask over Leo's face. "Acute bronchitis," she had said, her voice gentle but firm. "The inflammation is severe. We need to get him to the hospital at the emergency room." Under the merciless fluorescent lights, a doctor had spoken to her in hushed, serious tones. He used words like environmental triggers and airborne mold spores. He asked about their living conditions. As she described Unit 4B, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, pity and a weary frustration. He wrote a prescription for steroids and a new, more powerful inhaler. "He cannot go back to that environment," the doctor said, his words an impossible command. "His lungs can't take it." The next afternoon, Silas Croft had appeared at her door. He didn't knock. He used his own key, a stark reminder of who held the power. He stood in the middle of her small living room, his expensive leather shoes a jarring intrusion on the frayed, worn rug. He was a man who seemed to take up more space than his physical form required, radiating an aura of smug, unassailable entitlement. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "I heard you had some excitement last night," he said, his tone dripping with false concern. "And I hear you've been making complaints downtown." Elara stood before him, small and defiant. "My son is sick. The mold, the heat." Croft had laughed, a short, ugly bark. "The city says my building is fine, and sick kids are expensive. Which brings me to this." He pulled a folded paper from the inside pocket of his tailored coat and dropped it on the table. It was the final notice. 7 days. "The Owners Association is renovating," he lied smoothly. "Need the unit empty." Unfortunate timing. His eyes gleamed with malice. He was enjoying this. He was punishing her for daring to question him. After he left, the silence in the apartment was heavier than before. The world outside her door began to shrink. The next day, she saw Mrs. Gable in the hallway. The older woman's eyes darted away, refusing to meet her gaze. "I'm sorry, dear," she mumbled, fumbling with her keys. "I can't get involved." Croft, he watches everything. A few hours later, Mr. Chun from 4A, who had once offered to help fix her leaky faucet, hurried past her, his head down, pretending he didn't see her. The sound of his door closing, the sharp, definitive click of the deadbolt, was another wall being built around her. Fear was a contagion, and Croft was its carrier. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And so she stood, dripping rainwater onto the welcome mat of the Iron Saviors Motorcycle Club. The warmth from the clubhouse was a physical presence, a stark contrast to the bone-deep chill she had carried for weeks. Forge watched her, his expression unreadable. He had seen desperation before. It was a common currency in this part of the city. But this was different. It wasn't just the fear in her eyes. It was the exhaustion, the quiet, bone-deep weariness of a fighter who had been worn down by 1,000 small cuts. And yet, beneath it all, there was a core of unbending steel. He saw it in the set of her jaw, in the way she stood straight despite the trembling of her body. He gestured towards a heavy wooden table surrounded by mismatched chairs. "Sit." His voice was not unkind. She hesitated, then moved toward the table, clutching the small teddy bear to her chest like a shield. She placed it carefully on the polished wood. Its single button I seemed to survey the room, a silent, threadbare witness. The clubhouse was nothing like she had imagined. It wasn't chaotic or dirty. It was meticulously organized. Tools hung in perfect alignment on pegboard walls. Helmets were arranged on a long shelf, each one polished. The air smelled of oil and metal, but also of brewing coffee and wood smoke from a cast-iron stove in the corner. It was a workshop, a sanctuary. A few other men were in the room, their conversations halting as they watched her. They were large, bearded, and covered in leather, but their silence was watchful, not menacing. Forge poured coffee into a thick ceramic mug and pushed it across the table toward her. It was black and strong. She wrapped her cold hands around it, the warmth seeping into her skin. "Start from the beginning," he said, his voice a low command. And so she did. The words tumbled out, a torrent of frustration and fear held back for too long. She spoke of the mold, the cold, of Leo's wheezing breaths in the dark. She told him about Henderson at the housing authority, about his dismissive tone and the finality of his stamped denial. She described Croft's smug smile and the eviction notice. She spoke of the doors closing in her hallway, the averted eyes of her neighbors, the crushing weight of her isolation. She didn't cry. Her voice was flat, monotonous, as if she were reciting a list of facts from a great distance. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Forge stared at the teddy bear on the table. He reached out a large, calloused hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he touched the bear's matted fur. He saw the frayed seams, the places where a small child's hands had clutched it for comfort in a cold, dark room. In that moment, the abstract concepts of injustice and corruption became brutally, tangibly real. It was no longer just a story about a negligent landlord. It was about a little boy drawing a sun on a moldy wall. It was about a mother fighting a silent war in a forgotten corner of the city. He looked up, his steel-gray eyes meeting hers. A decision had been made, forged in the quiet space between her exhaustion and his code. The Iron Saviors had rules, unwritten but absolute. They did not seek trouble. They did not interfere in the affairs of others. But there was a line, and Silas Croft, with his casual cruelty, had crossed it. The protection of a child was not a choice. It was an obligation. He picked up his phone from the table. He didn't look at his contacts. He just dialed. The man on the other end answered on the first ring. Forge's voice was low, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "Code 86, he said. "The girl with the bear," he paused, listening. "Yeah, the whole chapter." Dawn, he hung up. He looked at Alara. "You and your boy won't be sleeping there tonight. Patch," he called to one of the men. "Get the back room ready. Clean sheets." Then he turned his attention to the large, laminated map of the city that covered one wall, and his focus became sharp, precise, and dangerously calm. The machine was now in motion. The call went out like a silent, invisible signal. Across the sprawling city, phones buzzed with a unique, coded vibration. In a garage in the suburbs, a man named Grizz, a mechanic with hands permanently stained with grease, was recalibrating a fuel injector. He saw the message, code 86, and carefully set down his tools. He wiped his hands on a red rag, his movements deliberate, unhurried. In a quiet high school classroom, a history teacher named Doc was grading papers under a desk lamp. He read the notification, took off his reading glasses, and placed a bookmark in a student's essay on civil disobedience. On the night shift in a city ambulance, a paramedic known as Stitch was cleaning his rig, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air. He felt the buzz in his pocket, glanced at the screen, and nodded once to himself. He would finish his shift at 5 a.m., just in time. From every corner of the metropolis and the surrounding towns, the response was the same. Immediate, unquestioning, and absolute. The Iron Saviors were not a gang of aimless rebels. They were a brotherhood of working men, mechanics, teachers, electricians, veterans, paramedics. Their bond was forged not in chaos, but in a shared, unspoken code of discipline and mutual support. By 3 a.m., the clubhouse was a hive of quiet, purposeful activity. There was no shouting, no bravado. The air was thick with a focused, controlled energy. Engines were started, their low, throaty rumbles a promise of contained power. Men moved with the practiced efficiency of a military unit, checking tire pressure, topping off fuel tanks, polishing chrome until it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It was a ritual, a form of meditation, preparing their machines and themselves for the task ahead. Forge stood over the large map, using a black marker to circle a downtown office building on the corner of 6th and Elm. Croft Tower. He drew lines indicating approach routes, designating parking formations. It was a logistical exercise, planned with tactical precision. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, in a small, brightly lit office, Anya Sharma's fingers flew across her keyboard. At 32, She was the youngest partner at a small but tenacious law firm that kept the Iron Saviors on a pro bono retainer for just this kind of occasion. She had received Forge's call minutes after Alara. Her instructions were simple. Croft, Henderson, burn it all down. Lawfully, Anya was a force of nature, a digital archaeologist who could unearth the buried sins of the powerful. With a few keystrokes, she was deep inside the city's labyrinthine databases. Property deeds, tax records, building permits, campaign contributions. She cross-referenced names, dates, and amounts, and a pattern began to emerge, faint at first, then sharpening into undeniable clarity. She found the inspection report for Alara's building, signed by Martin Henderson. Then she found 3 other reports for Croft-owned properties, all signed by Henderson, all passing with flying colors despite numerous tenant complaints logged in the system. Then came the breakthrough. A shell corporation, Elm Street Holdings, registered to an address that turned out to be a post office box. This corporation had received 3 payments from Croft Development over the last year. Labeled as consulting fees, a little more digging revealed the sole proprietor of Elm Street Holdings, Martin Henderson. Anya saved the documents to a secure drive, her expression grim. It wasn't just negligence. It was a criminal conspiracy. She made another call, this one to a contact at Channel 4 News. "I've got something for you," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Corner of 6th and Elm. Be there at 6 a.m. Trust me. You won't want to miss it." Dawn broke cold and gray over the city, the sky the color of dirty dishwater. At 5:55 a.m., the corner of 6th and Elm was quiet, home only to the early morning ballet of street sweepers and delivery trucks. Silas Croft would be arriving for work soon, accustomed to his private parking spot and the deferential nods of his employees. He would not be getting them today. At precisely 6 a.m., a sound began to build in the distance. It wasn't the chaotic roar of a mob, but a synchronized, harmonic rumble. The sound of 50 V-twin engines breathing as one. They came from 3 directions, a coordinated arrival that spoke of meticulous planning. They flowed into the streets surrounding Croft Tower, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. They were not loud, not aggressive. They moved with a slow, deliberate grace, a river of polished chrome and black leather. They parked in perfect, military-style chevrons, lining the streets on both sides of the building's main entrance. They filled every available legal parking space, their formation a silent, imposing blockade of lawful presence. The engines were cut in unison, and the sudden, profound silence that followed was more intimidating than the noise had been. The riders dismounted as one. They were men of all ages and sizes, united by the patched leather vests on their backs, the insignia of the Iron Saviors. They did not speak. They did not brandish weapons. They simply stood by their machines, arms folded, their collective gaze fixed on the glass and steel entrance of the tower. They were a silent, immovable testament to a promise being kept. The city began to wake up around them. Office workers on their way to early meetings stopped, their morning coffees growing cold in their hands. They stared, confused and intimidated. Cars slowed to a crawl, the drivers gawking at the silent assembly. The normal rhythm of the city had been disrupted. A news van from Channel 4 screeched to a halt a block away, a cameraman jumping out and hoisting his equipment onto his shoulder. The reporter, a young woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, began speaking into her microphone, her voice a mixture of excitement and disbelief. At 6:15 a.m., a black sedan pulled up to the entrance. Silas Croft got out, talking animatedly on his phone, a briefcase in his hand. He took 2 steps before he registered the scene. He stopped dead, his phone slipping from his grasp and clattering onto the pavement. His face, usually a mask of smug superiority, cycled through a rapid series of emotions. Confusion, then anger, then a flicker of genuine fear. He saw the vests, the silent, staring men, and the news camera pointed directly at him. This was not a random protest. This was personal. This was for him. His blustering, entitled world had just collided with a wall of silent, disciplined consequence. Anya Sharma arrived at 6:20 a.m. She was a stark contrast to the scene, dressed in a sharply tailored gray suit. Her black briefcase held firmly in her hand. She moved with an unhurried, confident stride. As she approached the line of silent bikers, they parted for her without a word, creating a clear path to the entrance of the building. It was a gesture of respect, an acknowledgement that she was their chosen instrument. Croft, flanked now by a flustered building security guard, regained some of his bravado. "What is the meaning of this?" he sputtered, his voice unnaturally high. "This is harassment. I'm calling the police." "That won't be necessary," Anya said, her voice cutting through the morning air, calm and precise. She stopped a few feet from him. The news camera zoomed in, capturing every detail. "Mr. Croft, my name is Anya Sharma. I represent Alara Vance and the other tenants of your property at 1412 North Ash Street." Croft's face paled. "I have no idea what you're talking about. Let me refresh your memory," Anya continued. Her tone as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. She opened her briefcase. "This is a report from an independent, certified industrial hygienist, confirming toxic levels of Stachybotrys chartarum, black mold, in Unit 4B. The spore count is 500 times the acceptable limit for a residential dwelling." She placed the report on the hood of Croft's sedan. "These are the medical records for 6-year-old Leo Vance, documenting 3 emergency room visits for acute bronchitis and asthma attacks directly linked to environmental mold exposure. His medical bills currently total $4,782. Another folder joined the first. "These are temperature logs, taken over a period of 2 weeks, showing that the ambient temperature inside Unit 4B never rose above 55 degrees Fahrenheit. A clear violation of City Ordinance 34B, which mandates a minimum of 68 degrees. A third folder landed with a soft thud. Croft was speechless, his face a mottled red. The security guard was backing away slowly. "And this?" Anya said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing everyone in, "is the most interesting document of all." She held up a single sheet of paper. "These are the incorporation papers for a company called Elm Street Holdings, and these are bank statements showing 3 wire transfers from Croft Development to Elm Street Holdings, totaling $50,000 over the last 12 months. The payments are listed as consulting fees." She paused, letting the silence hang in the air. "It's a shame, then, that the sole registered agent and beneficiary of Elm Street Holdings is a city employee named Martin Henderson." The name dropped like a stone into a silent pool. The mask on Croft's face shattered. The reporter was speaking rapidly into her microphone. Just then, a frail, elderly woman stepped out from the small crowd of onlookers that had gathered. It was Mrs. Gable from 3B. She was clutching a worn manila folder. "He did it to us too," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "The heating. He said it was our fault." A moment later, Mr. Chun from 4A stepped forward, holding a stack of his own papers. "My daughter has a rash. The doctor said it was the damp." Then another tenant and another. The dam of fear, held in place for so long by Croft's threats and the system's indifference, had just broken. The silent sentinels of the Iron Saviors did not move, but a current of grim satisfaction passed through their ranks. They had not come for violence. They had come to hold the space for the truth to be told. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Croft and Henderson. Before the news report had even finished its first broadcast cycle, the mayor's office issued a terse statement announcing that City Inspector Martin Henderson had been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by the Inspector General's office. By noon, detectives from the city's public corruption unit were at Croft's office with a search warrant. His empire, built on a foundation of exploitation and bribes, began to crumble. The Iron Saviors did not linger to watch the spectacle. Their purpose had been served. As silently as they had arrived, they mounted their bikes, and with a low, unified rumble, they departed, melting back into the city's traffic. Their job was done, but their work was not. That afternoon, they returned to the tenement on North Ash Street. Not with intimidation, but with cardboard boxes and moving dollies. They went to Unit 4B, where Alara was waiting, her face a mixture of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. They worked with a quiet, gentle efficiency that defied their rugged appearance. Grizz, the mechanic whose hands could rebuild an engine, now carefully wrapped Leo's crayon drawings in packing paper. Doc, the history teacher, meticulously organized the few books they owned. Stitch, the paramedic, dismantled Leo's small bed with practiced care. They moved through the cramped, mold-infested apartment like a team of guardian angels clad in leather. They loaded everything into a clean, moving truck one of their members owned. Forge himself carried the last two items. Leo in one arm and the one-eyed teddy bear, Patches, in the other. Their new apartment, arranged and paid for by Anya's firm through an emergency tenants fund, was in a different world. It was a clean, bright two-bedroom unit in a well-maintained building on the other side of town. The walls were freshly painted, the floors were clean, and sunlight streamed through large, clear windows. The saviors unloaded the truck with the same care they had shown in packing. They assembled the beds, moved the sparse furniture into place, and plugged in the refrigerator. Before they left, Forge walked over to the radiator in the living room. He knelt, pulled a small key from his pocket, and bled the valve, showing Alara how to do it herself. A hiss of air was followed by a gurgle of hot water. The radiator began to radiate a deep, comforting warmth. It was a small gesture, but a profound one. He was not just fixing a problem. He was giving her back a piece of control over her own life. As the men filed out, Leo, who had been watching everything with wide, silent eyes, ran to the window. He took a deep, shuddering breath. There was no whistle, no struggle, just the clean, easy sound of air filling healthy lungs. He laughed, a pure, clear sound that echoed in the warm, safe rooms. Alara watched him, tears finally streaming down her face. Not of fear or sorrow, but of a relief so profound it felt like she was breathing for the first time in years. A year later, the city was a different place for people like Alara. The scandal, which the media had dubbed Croftgate, had exposed a deep rot within the Department of Buildings. The subsequent investigation had led to 2 more indictments and a complete overhaul of the inspection process. The Henderson Act, a piece of sweeping municipal legislation, was passed by the City Council. It mandated that all low-income housing inspections be conducted by independent, third-party firms and established a new, fully funded tenant advocacy office with the power to sue negligent landlords on behalf of residents. The class-action lawsuit Anya Sharma had filed on behalf of the tenants of 1412, North Ash Street, and 3 other Croft-owned properties had resulted in a multi-million-dollar settlement. After the legal fees and the compensation for the tenants, a significant sum remained. At Anya's suggestion, the Iron Saviors used the money to establish the Guardian Fund, a non-profit foundation dedicated to providing pro bono legal services and emergency repair assistance for low-income families trapped in unsafe housing. On a bright Saturday morning, the fund was in action. Grizz, the mechanic, was on his back under a sink in an elderly woman's apartment, expertly fixing a leak that her landlord had ignored for 6 months. Doc, the teacher, was sitting at a kitchen table, helping a recent immigrant fill out the complex paperwork to report a code violation. Stitch, the paramedic, was installing new, battery-powered carbon monoxide detectors in a building full of young families. They worked without fanfare, their payment the quiet satisfaction of a job well done, of a community being mended one leaky faucet, one filled-out form, one safe home at a time. Alara's life had been transformed. She had a new job working at a branch of the public library, surrounded by the quiet and the smell of old paper and endless possibility. She was taking night classes at the community college, studying to become a paralegal, inspired by Anya's fierce advocacy. The fear that had been her constant companion was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence. She and Leo lived in their sunny apartment, a place that was truly a home. In the late afternoon, they were at a park near their building. Leo, now 7 and thriving, was on the swings, pumping his legs, trying to go higher and higher, his laughter carrying on the breeze. Alara sat on a bench, watching him, a book open in her lap. In the distance, the sound of a single motorcycle echoed as it passed on the nearby highway, a deep, throaty rumble. A year ago, that sound would have made her flinch. It was the sound of something big, unknown, and potentially dangerous. But now, she heard it and she didn't feel fear. She felt a quiet sense of peace. She looked up from her book, a small, genuine smile gracing her lips. It was no longer the sound of a threat. It was the sound of guardianship. It was the sound of a promise, made on a rainy night to a desperate woman clutching a one-eyed teddy bear. A promise that had been kept.